Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a fascinating and I think a deeply needed shortcut into a cultural flashpoint.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. It's about the ongoing resistance in contemporary media against the strong, capable male hero. Our mission today is to analyze source material that posits this resistance. The whole idea is based on a fundamental misreading of what those classic archetypes actually.
And more importantly, why they were so universally successful in the first place.
Exactly.
It's a crucial distinction to make because this isn't, just about nostalgia for 80s action films or something like that.
No, not at all.
We are dissecting the arguments that label the traditional strong masculine hero, what the commentary calls the alpha male hero, as being inherently toxic.
And our source material, it provides a compelling, almost forensic argument. It uses specific, enduring cinematic examples to prove that the supposed toxicity critics are railing against today.
Often wasn't even present in the originals.
Yeah.
In fact, the source argues these narratives, often centered on profound moral virtue.
So the genesis of this deep dive, it's rooted in a very specific trigger event that the source material focused on. There's been a lot of chatter about the potential sale of Warner Bros. With Netflix and Paramount being floated as possible buyers.
Right, the usual industry buzz.
But what captured the commentators' attention wasn't the sale itself, but the immediate and intense reaction to the idea that Paramount might lean into producing more of these so-called alpha male movies.
Exactly. The source described it as instant pearl clutching, that's their term. A really dramatic, adverse reaction that seemed completely out of step with the concept itself.
And we should be clear here, right? The source wasn't defending Paramount.
No, not at all. It's essential. We clarify what the source was focused on. They weren't endorsing them as some flawless studio or anything.
The point was solely the intense cultural outrage.
Yes. Outrage directed at the concept of centering content around this kind of traditionally strong male character. That immediate, almost visceral rejection, that became the starting point for this whole analysis. Why is the concept itself now so controversial?
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we can really analyze the controversy, we need a clear definition. What exactly defines this alpha male hero in the context of the films we're talking about? And why did this archetype, dominate popular culture for so long?
Well, the source defines this character as essentially an elevated version of the core hero archetype.
An upgraded version.
An upgraded version, exactly. This is a character who is super capable and larger than life.
Right.
Someone who doesn't wait for permission or follow the rule book, but rather steps into a helpless or profoundly dangerous situation and immediately takes control.
So they're decisive, they're physically tough, often tough talking.
And they operate, if necessary, outside the standard scope of law or civilian ability because the situation absolutely demands it.
So we're talking about competence applied to chaos. But why is the wish fulfillment so strong here? What makes that so?
The popularity stems from a deeply fundamental human element of fantasy. And this is the surprising. The source argues this appeals to everyone, regardless of gender or background.
Everyone.
To everyone. Think about the scenario. The audience is placed in the position of the helpless. You watch office workers trapped by terrorists or a whole civilization facing collapse.
So we, the viewers, are vicariously experiencing the terror and the helplessness.
Exactly.
And the fantasy isn't necessarily that we want to be violent, but that we want to be effective.
Precise. The viewer wishes they were that character. The one person capable of rising above the chaos, finding the solution and implementing it, often through sheer willpower and competence.
Right.
It's the catharsis of seeing a seemingly impossible problem solved by exceptional, determined capability.
And the source makes a point that these characters don't have superpowers, right?
Yes, that's vital. They have super capability. This is a crucial distinction because it makes their competence feel attainable even if it's extreme.
Right.
It's the ultimate, I can handle this scenario.
Okay, but here's where the analysis takes a really sharp turn. Because despite this being a core human fantasy, rooting for the capable person to defeat the bad guy, the source notes that today, many influential commentators and writers are intensely afraid of this very idea.
They're afraid of it.
Yeah. They immediately assign the label of toxic to this specific blend of capability, control, and, traditional masculinity.
And that intense resistance is the core puzzle we are exploring here. The source really challenges the assumption that the traits of capability and control, when embodied by a male character, must be inherently negative.
So the argument is, if the modern media landscape is so resistant, what do we do?
Well, the only way to test that resistance is to go back and forensically examine the classic examples.
The movies that have lasted.
The movies that have endured for decades, exactly. To see if that toxicity was ever truly embedded in the narrative structure itself. Was the hero's success tied to negative behavior, or was it tied to moral commitment?
So what does this all mean? Let's stop talking abstractly and move directly into the film text itself.
Let's do it.
Our first case study, according to the source, is the quintessential example, Die Hard.
The perfect place to start.
The commentator watched it recently and instantly deemed it the platonic ideal of the alpha male.
And we absolutely must immediately pause for the mandatory, albeit, entertaining side note that the source was extremely emphatic about.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Die Hard is definitively a Christmas movie.
They were very clear on this point. Anyone who disagrees is, and I'm quoting the source here, insane.
And their argument is actually logistically compelling.
It is. The film's entire premise relies on the holiday setting. The central conflict hinges on the protagonist, John McClane, returning home with Gase for his family, trying to patch up a marriage.
And it all revolves around an office Christmas party.
Exactly. You just don't get that specific blend of relational pressure and office gathering outside of December. It wouldn't work.
Right. But beyond the holiday debate, the source praises Die Hard as just a beautifully constructed film. The film craft is incredibly tight and intentional.
They point out how the writing meticulously sets up both McClane's vulnerability and his competence.
Yes, take the shoes, for example. The specific setup for why he doesn't have shoes, why he's barefoot and exposed, it's established so early on.
And it explains why the majority of the action movie is fought with him suffering this extreme physical vulnerability.
Walking over glass.
Yeah, walking over glass. It's not just a random detail.
No, it's baked into the very fabric of the plot.
And that attention to detail is so critical. McClane is certainly capable. He's tough-talking. He successfully uses his wits and his training to fight the terrorists.
We get that famous line, "Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy Yippee?"
But the source notes that what elevates him above, a generic action figure is his constant relatable struggle.
Mm-hmm.
The audience is constantly engaged in the question, how is he still alive? How can he possibly take one more hit?
And that combination of extreme capability and intense vulnerability, that's what makes him a larger-than-life figure who still remains deeply human.
And that humanity, that leads us directly to the moral core of the film, which is the source's key counterargument against this whole talk label.
This is the heart of it. The source argues that if you strip away the explosions and the one-liners, the entire plot and McClane's entire character arc, they don't center on him conquering Hans Gruber. They center on him reconciling with his wife, Holly.
So the physical conflict is just the catalyst.
It's the catalyst for the moral and relational redemption. That's the real story.
Wow, that really shifts the entire folk film.
It does.
The hero, the quintessential alpha male archetype that modern critics oppose here, spends the whole movie desperately trying to earn back the respect of his wife. He's placing her and their marriage ahead of.
And the source highlights the detailed character work that reveals McClane's fault wasn't his job or his inherent strength, but his professional insecurity.
Right, his lack of support for his wife.
Exactly. Holly Gennaro has found success in L.A., and John just couldn't handle moving from New York and supporting her success. That's the internal conflict driving everything.
Okay, let's delve into the specific evidence the source, because the dialogue is... McClane isn't portrayed as some perfect, strong hero who simply saves the day.
Not at all. He's a man admitting he failed his wife.
And he does it explicitly.
He explicitly admits his faults in a very vulnerable moment when he sends that message to Al Powell, the police officer outside.
Yeah, that scene.
He says, and I'm paraphrasing the detailed quote provided by the source, "I want you to tell her that I told her it took me a while to figure out what a jerk I've been.
What a jerk I've been.
That when things started to pan out for her, I should have been more supportive. Tell her that she is the best thing that ever happened to a bum like me."
That admission is the moral climax of the film. It's arguably more important than any gunshot.
Absolutely. It reframes his whole struggle.
He isn't fighting to prove he's the toughest guy in the room. He's fighting to prove he is worthy of his family. He's acknowledging that his own pride, his own ego, led to the breakdown of their...
And the symbolic resolution at the very end reinforces this narrative perfectly. At the start of the movie, Holly is referred to as Holly Gennaro.
Right. She explicitly does not want to use his last...
which symbolizes the professional distance and the emotional breakdown caused by his lack of support.
But by the end,
they exit the building. She instinctively takes his last. The source views this as a really powerful symbol. The marriage is fully reconciled.
And it's built on John's admission of his failure and his successful, albeit very violent, demonstration of commitment. So The powerful implication the source draws is profound. If a universally loved, enduring alpha male mood centers entirely on the hero's central moral fault being his lack of support for his wife's career,
and his redemption is based on admitting he was a jerk,
then what is truly toxic about that character? The movie has lasted precisely because the persona is flawed, but the core narrative is one of moral responsibility and support for the woman he loved.
It just strongly undercuts the modern critique that this archetype is inherently negative or simplistic.
It forces us to ask, are critics today dismissing the entire archetype based purely on its appearance?
The tough exterior, the gun, the capacity for violence.
Right. Are they just looking at the surface without ever actually analyzing the substance?
Yeah.
The underlying moral drive, the internal flaw, and the ultimate redemption.
Because if the critique only focuses on the surface, it entirely misses the point of why these characters resonated with so many people for so long.
That brings us perfectly to our second case study, Gladiator. Here, we move from the modern, contained action hero to the historical noble warrior. And the source finds a very similar dynamic at play, where the hero's strength is inextricably linked to his moral purity.
In Gladiator, we see Maximus, a man defined by incredible capability and leadership. But the source analysis focuses less on his competence in the arena,
and more on the battle behind the scenes to preserve his moral core.
Exactly. Contrasting the successful original film with the creative choices that were reportedly made for the sequel, Gladiator 2.
Okay, this takes us right into that behind-the-scenes anecdote, the source who illuminate the character's moral...
Yes, specifically Russell Crowe's alleged influence during the production of the first film.
Well, I found this part fast.
The source highlights recent statements from Crowe about the making of the film, suggesting he basically functioned as the critical moral compass for the entire narrative.
And the source claims that the original writers, their creative inclinations, would have drastically compromised Maximus's virtue.
Yeah, that's the story. Specifically, they wanted to include sex scene and even have Maximus cheat on his wife.
So they were actively trying to muddy the waters, to introduce a moral compromise that would just fundamentally dilute purity of purpose and his heroic standing.
Absolutely. And Crowe reportedly resisted these decisions fiercely. His argument was that the film's moral center had to be unimpeachable.
It had to be pure.
It had to be pure. Maximus had to be a fundamentally good man who loved his family above all else. His entire motivation, his relentless pursuit of revenge, his immense strength in the face of absolute despair.
All of it had to be rooted in the pure love for his wife.
Yeah, if he was flawed in that one commitment, the audience just wouldn't fully invest in his vengeance as a righteous person.
So the source's conclusion here is strong. Because Crowe successfully resisted the writer's alleged worst inclination, Maximus remained a
character defined by loyalty and moral clarity.
His strength wasn't just random aggression, it was channeled grief and righteous rage, fueled by his moral commitment.
And this creates the perfect contrast for the source to pivot to the alleged mistake of the sequel.
Right, Gladiator 2.
The source notes that early information regarding Gladiator 2 suggested it canonized the affair, the very thing Crowe resisted, allegedly stating it produced Paul Mescal's character.
So that single narrative choice, according to the source, symbolically poisons the foundation of the original hero.
It does. It retrospectively complicates the original Maximus's nobility, removing the purity of his purpose, which was, again, his uncompromising love and revenge for his family.
It reduces him to a more typical flawed hero, but in a way that, according to the source, destroys the whole thematic purpose.
Furthermore, the source critiques Gladiator 2 as just a weaker film overall, and part of that is due to the main character's portrayal.
They specifically note the sequel character's muted or sort of ambiguous reaction to his own wife's death.
Yes, contrasting that sharply with the burning, defining devotion that Max...
And the source argues that this ambiguity and dilution of moral commitment is the new form of masculinity that modern storytelling seems to favor.
One that removes the clear moral center, resulting in a less compelling, less noble, and ultimately less successful figure.
So, the synthesis point holds true across genres. The classic, supposedly toxic alpha male hero, Maximus in this case, is one who defines his strength through his loyalty and devotion,
channeling his power toward justice and the defense of his family.
Just like McClane, his capability is rooted in a profound moral purpose. The source argues there is a lot of positivity found in these classic, strong, masculine characters,
which suggests the modern perception of toxicity is a narrative construct, not an inherent text flaw.
If we look at both Die Hard and Gladiator, the narrative arc isn't strong man does whatever.
No, it's strong man overcomes his own pride, McClane, or faces impossible odds, Maximus, because he loves his wife and family absolutely. That is the formula that generates both catharsis and enduring artistic value.
Okay, so the question then becomes, if the classic formula was fundamentally moral, How did we get to the current cultural consensus where this archetype is actively feared, labeled toxic, and, replaced?
Right. How did...
The source posits that this shift is not they date its origins back approximately 10 years ago, coinciding with a concerted shift in major...
And that 10-year mark is important because it aligns with a major pivot in blockbuster filmmaking strategy. Moving toward reboots, sequels, and shared universes.
And the source points directly to the Disney remakes of the Star Wars franchise, specifically The Force Awakens, which they describe as a poor remake of A New Hope, as ground zero for where these new tropes began and have just proliferated across media. Let's dedicate some time to this analysis because if The Force Awakens is the key example of the current media playbook, we need to understand the source critique of the specific element.
The critique breaks down into 3 interconnected tropes that the source argues were implemented pretty systematically. First, the introduction of what they term the girl boss archetype, embodied by Rey.
Right.
Second, the intentional sidelining of the traditional male hero into what they call the emasculated male character, and they point to Finn's trajectory. And third, the symbolic, often aggressive, tearing apart of legacy male character, which speaks to a broader thematic agenda.
Let's start with Rey and the girl boss archetype, as defined by the... What differentiates her capability from, say, Holly Gennaro's strength in Die Hard?
The distinction is about how the capability is acquired and presented. The source argues that the girl boss archetype often displays immediate, unearned, or unexplained competence.
So it just appears out of nowhere.
Yeah, Rey is presented as capable in every skill required. Pilot, mechanic, fighter, strategist from the very beginning.
Without the traditional narrative arc of learning, struggling, and failing that defined previous heroes like Luke Skywalker.
Exactly. The source posits that this immediate, frictionless competence is itself a narrative shortcut that ironically mirrors the most criticized aspect of traditional alpha heroes.
Yeah.
The idea of effortless superiority.
In contrasting that, we have the emasculated male character, Finn. How does the source analyze his journey in the subsequent films?
Well, Finn, who was introduced as a stormtrooper with immense potential and a moral awakening, is, in the source's view, systematically humiliated by those movies from the beginning.
Humiliated? That's a strong word.
It is. His initial strong narrative purpose, a conflicted fighter seeking redemption, was, according to the source, rapidly diffused. He often serves as comic relief or as a less competent sidekick to Rey.
And the source views this as a deliberate narrative choice.
A very deliberate choice to ensure that the male character, even the new one, is never allowed to ascend to that positive position of power and control that the alpha hero represents.
And the most stinging critique seems to be reserved for the fate of the legacy characters, Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. What was the thematic implication tearing them down?
This is where the source sees the clearest evidence of an agenda-targeting tradition. Han Solo, the ultimate anti-hero, who achieved emotional maturity by the end of the original trilogy.
He had all of that character development just taken away.
Completely erased. He reverted to a state similar to the beginning of his journey, a cynical smuggler, only to die what the source labels a pretty meaningless death.
The death that lacks the weight or payoff of a true heroic sacrifice.
Right, is the undoing of their growth, not just their death, that the source really highlights.
And then there's Luke Skywalker, the ultimate hero, the ideal figure of strength and moral aspiration.
Was simply sent away to a remote island. His character arc and motivation, when we finally get it revealed, involved him being deeply cynical and having failed in his mission.
It's a complete reversal.
It is. The source views this as a calculated narrative choice to dismantle the established male figures of power and control, suggesting that the industry just no longer wanted heroes who could embody that level of moral and physical authority.
So, if the classic heroes like McClane and Max proved that capability could be intrinsically linked to high, the source argues the motivation behind these modern tropes is not necessarily about improving moral clarity, but about something else entirely.
Dismantling tradition and subverting gender norms.
That is the crucial and I'd say highly charged argument the source.
It is. And we must be clear that this material posits that the underlying motivation is a desire to prevent the male character from being in a positive position of power and control.
We're conveying their argument.
We are conveying their argument, which suggests that the goal is not to improve the quality of storytelling, but to deny the male character that ultimate position of capable authority.
Okay, let's introduce some of the constructive skepticism that a deep dive requires here. Is the source being fair to modern writers?
Well, that's the thing. They claim the previous heroes were toxic, but the source points out this ultimate irony.
What's that?
The replacement characters often display the very negative traits the critics supposedly hated in the first place.
The irony, according to the source, while modern writers claim the old heroes were toxic, due to their tough exterior or their control.
They often push forward these girl boss replacement characters who, paradoxically, very much come off as that toxic masculine position that a lot of these writers perceive that these male heroes were originally in.
So you're saying the replacement character has the surface-level competence and aggression, but lacks the crucial moral foundation.
Exactly. The commitment to family or the acknowledgement of personal fault that define the classic figures.
The modern version takes the take charge element, but strips it of the moral reckoning and the vulnerability that made McLean or Maximus so relatable and admirable.
Yes. They become simply figures of unassailable, often emotionally distant competence. The source argues this demonstrates that the critics fundamentally misunderstand or misread core dynamics of the class.
So they label the surface trait of taking control as toxic.
Yet they assign that exact behavior minus the moral depth to the character intended to replace the alpha.
This leads to the source's extremely provocative overall that the resistance isn't really about narrative complexity or improved morality, but that people, or at least the influencers in media, just actually don't like masculinity in general.
Or at least they don't like the norm of having the male character portrayed as strong, tough, and in a positive position of power.
The source suggests that if modern critics were forced to admit that there was nothing morally wrong with the classic masculine heroes,
that they were good men fighting for good reasons,
then those critics would have to admit there aren't necessarily good motivations behind the people trying to push the current subversion agenda.
The resistance becomes not a search for better characters, but a political rejection of an established dynamic.
And the source claims this resistance isn't isolated to cinema, but connected to broader cultural trends. They claim this is part of a concerted effort to tear apart gender dynamics.
It's a massive claim.
It is, and we need to handle it neutrally, ensuring we attribute it clearly to the source material we are reviewing.
Absolutely. The source validates this claim by citing an example of the kind of commentary that permeates the current cultural landscape. They mention articles that kept showing up on their feed this year, asking questions like,
is it embarrassing to have a boyfriend right now?
Right, that exact question.
Yeah.
This kind of societal commentary is used by the source as evidence that the effort to redefine or dismantle the traditional male role in media is mirrored by a concerted push in general societal commentary to undermine established norms and relationships.
It links the fictitious destruction of Han Solo's marriage and Luke Skywalker's purpose to a real-world attempt to question the fundamental value of male partnership.
That is precisely the source's analogy. The cultural criticism against the alpha male hero in film is, in their view, merely a visible symptom of a larger effort to tear down what is normal.
Even when, upon closer inspection, as we saw with Die Hard and Gladiator, the original normal had a robust, positive moral structure centered on loyalty, love, and protection.
You have two classic examples, both with alpha male leads, and both were fundamentally about how much they loved their wife. The resistance, therefore, must be about something other than toxicity.
That is a powerful summation of the cultural and narrative argument. But the source doesn't stop at ideology.
No, they don't.
They introduce a very strong, practical economic argument that pursuing this subversion agenda is actively destroying Hollywood's bottom line.
And this is the final layer of the commentary, and it is firmly rooted in practical reality. The source strongly suggests that this focus on pearl clutching and following a creative mindset that, frankly, doesn't even make sense from a storytelling perspective,
is having a direct, measurable negative impact on Hollywood's finances.
A huge impact.
Okay, explain how the source connects ideological choices directly to lost revenue. What's the mechanism of failure here?
The mechanism is actually very simple. Audience rejection of characters that fail the wish fulfillment test. If the core fantasy is rooted in rooting for capable, morally committed people, and modern media denies that capability or strips away the morality, the audience simply stays home.
It's a financial vote.
It is. The source argues that when legacy characters are torn down, or when replacement characters are inserted without the necessary struggle or depth, the audience senses the artifice. They sense the underlying ideological push, and they reject it financially.
So the economic conviction is clear. The resistance to the alpha male hero is an active drain on industry revenue because audiences are hungry for that specific, morally sound type of catharsis again.
They want to root for the person who can handle the chaos.
Absolutely. The source firmly believes that bringing the alpha male hero back, the morally defined, capable hero, not the simplistic, toxic caricature, would bring a lot of money to Hollywood.
They see it as a completely untapped demand. People want aspirational figures who succeed, not just flawed figures who struggle and ultimately fail to live up to the legacy, which has been the trend for the last decade.
So if we break down the economics further, we are looking at opportunity cost. By focusing on niche ideological subversion, Hollywood is sacrificing the universal appeal that made films like Die Hard and Gladiator successful multi-generational hits.
That's the core of the financial critique. The films we analyzed are universal because the themes, redemption, loyalty, the protection of family, are universal.
Right.
When modern narratives replace those universal themes with highly specific, non-aspirational, or ideologically driven messaging, they narrow the potential audience drastically. The source argues that this is financially punitive.
The more they follow this negative mindset, the more money they are going to lose.
Because they are prioritizing the vocal minority of critics over the desires of the broad paying audience who simply want to see the capable person.
It's fascinating how the source connects a decades-old marital conflict in a Christmas movie to the current box office.
It is.
It suggests that the formula for success was already morally complex, and abandoning that complexity for the sake of simplified moralizing is what led to the failure.
It really boils down to this. The source claims that the cultural leaders are mistaking the capacity for violence, which is necessary for action, for toxicity, which is a moral failure.
So they're confusing two different things.
Completely. They fail to see that in the classic film, the violence was almost always morally constrained and directed toward justice. The critique thus becomes blind to the actual narrative morality.
So what we have is a dramatic contrast confirmed across multiple genres.
Yeah.
The classic alpha male hero as a noble, moral figure whose capability is motivated by love and versus the modern perception that the archetype is inherently toxic and must be actively dismantled or replaced.
Replaced with a character who, ironically, often displays the very moral emptiness that critics claim to hate.
That is the ultimate conclusion drawn from this analysis. The source provides powerful textual evidence that these classic heroes were not toxic, but instead aspirational figures defined by their commitment.
And the modern resistance is therefore interpreted by the source as a rejection of strength and control in a traditional context, regardless of the positive moral application of that strength.
A truly fantastic deep dive into deeply provocative source material. Thank you for helping us unpack why the fear of the capable hero persists today, despite the enduring success and moral clarity of the originals.
My pleasure.
And for you, the listener, we really encourage you to go back and watch some of these classics through this very specific lens. Analyze John McClane's character arc. Is his primary motivation fighting terrorists, or is it winning back his wife? Does that distinction change how you, the culture?
It raises an important final thought to mull over. If the ultimate cinematic fantasy is feeling capable and in control when the world around you descends into chaos, and that formula has consistently made immense money while simultaneously promoting core moral virtue like loyalty, familial commitment, and self-sacrifice, is the modern industry resistance truly about improving morality? Or is it fundamentally about rejecting the concept of power and strength being placed in a traditional male role, regardless of its noble and lucrative application?
A powerful question.
Think about what happens when an entire industry actively resists providing the catharsis audiences are willing to pay for.
Something to mull over as Zoom Your Media this. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch